You are listening to Paid Ad Intelligence series on Ecom Expedition with Asim. I'm your co-host, Erica. Last episode, we covered Google Search, which really sits at the intent-driven core of most e-commerce strategies, and today we're going deeper into Google's ecosystem with Performance Max. What it actually is, why Google built it, what you give up when you use it, and how the brands that are getting real results are actually setting it up. Asim, I feel like this is one of those things a lot of founders are already running in their accounts, but if you ask them how it actually works, the answer is usually a bit unclear, so maybe start from there.
Yeah, and that lack of clarity isn't surprising, because Performance Max didn't really enter the market as something people explored gradually. It showed up as a replacement for something they were already using. So instead of stepping back and rethinking the system, most advertisers just kept optimizing inside it, even though the underlying logic had changed quite a bit.
So it wasn't so much adopted as it was absorbed into the way accounts were already running.
That's a better way to put it. And if you go back for a second, before Performance Max, running Google Ads for e-commerce meant managing separate campaigns across different parts of the ecosystem. You had shopping for product listings, search for keyword intent, display for broader reach, YouTube if you wanted video, and each of those lived in its own lane, built separately, optimized separately, and often competing for budget without really sharing information.
Which sounds organized, but also a bit disconnected when you look at how those pieces interact.
That's exactly what it was. And the limitation there is that each campaign only had access to a slice of the available data. And around the same time, that limitation started to matter more. Because the signal environment was shifting quite quickly, tracking was becoming less precise, targeting was getting weaker, and the old approach of manually stitching everything together wasn't as effective as it used to be.
You're referring to the privacy changes that started building around that period.
Yes, iOS changes, cookie deprecation, broader signal loss across platforms, all of that was happening at the same time. So Google's response wasn't to refine each campaign type individually. It was to consolidate, to bring everything into one system that could use its internal data more effectively and make decisions across channels instead of inside those separate silos.
And that's where Performance Max starts to make sense as a direction.
Exactly, because once you see the problem they were trying to solve, the structure becomes easier to understand. It launched in 2021. And then fairly quickly Google migrated smart shopping campaigns into it. So a large portion of e-commerce spend moved into this new system. And most advertisers didn't actively choose that shift. They adapted to it as it happened.
Which explains why a lot of people are using it without really understanding how it behaves under the hood.
Right, because the behavior is quite different. Instead of you deciding where ads show, who sees them, or how bids are adjusted, you're providing inputs, your creative assets, your product feed, your conversion goals. And then the system decides everything else. Placements across search, shopping, YouTube, display, audiences, timing, bidding, all of it is handled algorithmically.
That sounds efficient on one level, but also a bit uncomfortable, because you're stepping away from decisions you used to control directly.
That's the trade-off you're making, and it's a real one. Because when the system has the right inputs, it can operate at a level of scale and speed that manual campaigns can't match. But when those inputs aren't strong, the system doesn't fix that for you. It amplifies whatever signal you've given it, whether that signal is good or not.
So when people say Performance Max works, what are they actually seeing in the data?
There is genuine performance in many cases. You'll see campaigns hitting strong return on ad spend targets and delivering results that look very efficient, which is why the format has gained so much traction. But the important part is understanding what's contributing to that performance, because not all of it is incremental.
Is that where the branded search issue becomes important?
Yes, and it's one of the first things worth checking, because by default Performance Max will bid on branded search terms. So when someone searches for your brand, which often indicates very high intent already, the campaign captures that interaction and attributes the conversion to itself.
So it's taking credit for something that might have happened anyway.
That's the concern. And when that happens consistently, the return on ad spend can look very strong. But part of that performance is inflated, because those conversions were already likely. So unless branded terms are excluded, you're not getting a clear view of how much new demand the campaign is actually creating.
And for a while there wasn't much control over that behavior.
That was part of the challenge. And even now that controls exist, many accounts haven't implemented them. So when you look at the numbers, it's worth checking what's included, because that context changes how you interpret performance.
Beyond that, there's also the visibility issue. People often describe Performance Max as a black box. Has that improved in any meaningful way?
It has improved somewhat. There are more controls and reporting layers now than there were initially. You can apply negative keywords at the campaign level. You can see how different surfaces are contributing. You get more feedback on asset performance. And search themes give you a way to guide intent, so it's not completely opaque anymore. But compared to traditional search or shopping campaigns, you're still working with less visibility.
So you can guide it, but you can't fully see inside it.
That's a fair way to describe it, which means the setup becomes even more important, because your influence sits in the inputs rather than in day-to-day execution decisions.
So when you're setting it up, where does most of the leverage actually come from?
Asset group structure is one of the biggest levers, because it shapes how the system understands your products and your business. And when everything is bundled into one broad group, the signals become diluted. Whereas when you organize asset groups around clear categories or themes, the system has a more precise starting point to work from.
So the clearer the structure, the clearer the learning signal.
That's the idea. And the same principle applies to audience signals, which are often misunderstood because they're not strict targeting rules. They act more like guidance. You're showing the system examples of valuable users, your customers, your site visitors, your lists, and then it expands beyond those to find similar patterns.
So you're influencing direction rather than controlling reach.
Exactly. And the quality of those signals affects where the system begins its exploration, which has a meaningful impact on performance over time.
What about how Performance Max fits alongside standard shopping now? Because that relationship changed recently.
That change was quite important, because previously Performance Max had priority when both campaign types were eligible, which meant it would absorb most of the traffic. But now they compete on ad rank, so you can run them together without one automatically taking over.
Which gives you more flexibility in how you structure the account.
It does. And what you're seeing in well-managed accounts is a deliberate split. Standard shopping is used for core products where control and visibility matter, while Performance Max acts as a broader layer, extending reach into areas that search alone doesn't fully capture.
And that's where the budget balance comes into play.
Yes, in many cases there's a heavier allocation towards standard shopping, with Performance Max supporting it, which allows you to combine control with the benefits of automation at scale.
There's also the issue of products that don't get exposure inside Performance Max.
That tends to happen in larger catalogs, because the system prioritizes products that already have conversion data. So your top performers receive most of the attention, while long-tail products don't get enough visibility to generate data in the first place.
So they stay invisible because they haven't proven themselves yet.
Exactly. And to address that, you need a separate structure, where those products can generate initial data, often through standard shopping with a different bidding approach. And once they have enough signal, they can be brought back into Performance Max in a way the system can actually optimize.
So stepping back from everything we've covered, when does Performance Max actually make sense to use?
It tends to work best when a few conditions are in place. You need enough conversion volume for the system to learn effectively. You need accurate tracking because the algorithm depends entirely on that data. And you need strong creative assets because those are what get distributed across the network. And when those elements are aligned, it can produce results that are difficult to replicate manually.
And where does it tend to struggle?
It struggles when it's underfunded, because it doesn't gather enough data to stabilize. It struggles when tracking is incomplete, because the optimization is based on an incomplete picture. And it tends to underperform when branded traffic isn't controlled, because the results become inflated and harder to interpret.
And the idea that it runs itself probably doesn't help either.
That assumption creates problems, because automation doesn't remove the need for management. It changes where the effort goes. Instead of adjusting bids and placements, you're working on improving inputs, refining assets, strengthening signals, and shaping the structure. And that requires ongoing attention.
So the leverage shifts rather than disappears.
That's right. And when those inputs are strong, the system can scale effectively. But when they're weak, the same system amplifies those weaknesses, so both the upside and the downside increase.
That's a useful frame going into the next episode, because we're moving into Meta and Advantage Plus, which operates on a similar idea but in a different environment. If you understand this model, you're already starting to see where paid media is heading. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and we'll see you in the next one.